series. Thanks for taking the time today to spend with us to learn more about brain injury. Brain injury, as we know, is a significant public health issue, and I know that you're going to find our webinar interesting and informative. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors and advertisers. Without you, we couldn't get the job done. So thank you for being with us. And now I'd like to introduce our premier sponsor, Encompass Health. Enjoy your day. Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Sharp. I'm the executive.
Growing up, I could always count on my dad to help me make the right choice, from the right eyeglasses to the right college. So after he suffered a stroke, I knew it was my turn to help him make the right choice in rehabilitation. I asked his doctor who she trusted for the best care and outcome, and she said, Encompass Health, the nation's largest system of rehabilitation hospitals and the name more medical professionals refer to. My dad has always wanted what's best for me, so I did what's best for him. Encompass Health.
We're grateful to Encompass Health, the premier sponsor of the conference series for the past 2 years. We're happy to be supported by the team of injury law attorneys at Marasco and Nesselbush. For more than 20 years, Marasco and Nesselbush has provided trusted legal care for clients who have sustained brain injuries as a result of an accident, such as a motor vehicle crash. The Marasco and Nesselbush team knows all too well the devastating impact that a traumatic brain injury can have on the injured person and their family. The firm has handled hundreds of cases involving brain injuries and has the resources and experience to ensure that their clients recover as best as they can and are also fully compensated for their injuries. We also like to thank the Department of Health and Human Services, whose funding helps BRE to provide programs and resources to the brain injury community in Rhode Island. Okay. Friends of BRE also include Neighborhood Health, Neurorestorative, Robin Hill Farm, OSL, Speechworks Rhode Island, Just Ask Aphasia Group, Avatar, and the Roman Catholic Diocese of Providence. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third session of the Brain Injury Association of Rhode Island's 21st Annual Conference Series. My name is Doreen Grasso, and I'm the Education and Program Manager here at BRE, and we're delighted you could join us today to learn about how brain injury exacerbates pre-existing conditions, presented by Dr. Janine Crifasi. Before I introduce our speaker, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. Everyone has been sent an evaluation, and your feedback is very important to us. And it's also your ticket to your CEUs if you so choose. So when you do complete your CEU evaluation form, fully complete it, answering all the questions, including your name and what CEU type you're looking for, and return it to richard@biari.org so we can easily process your application. You should get a CEU within probably a week. Lastly, please type any comments and questions that you have into the chat room area. We have reserved some time for some Q&A with Dr. Crifasi at the end of the presentation. So thank you for that. And I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Crifasi is a board certified doctor of chiropractic and has board certification in chiropractic functional neurology through the American Chiropractic Neurology Board. That's a mouthful. For 25 years, Dr. Crifasi has been serving families from coast to coast with a focus on women's health, sports, and motor vehicle injuries. Her goal is to guide patients in ways to achieve better health naturally. In order to help patients with musculoskeletal conditions, she has received additional training in spinal trauma, the activator method, and a certification in postural neurology. Dr. Crifasi also completed postdoctoral specialty training in blood chemistry, thyroid chemistry, brain chemistry, neuroimmune, and neuroendocrine functional medicine. This knowledge of the brain-gut axis and the mechanisms that impact health allow her to provide patients with easily implemented and therapeutic lifestyle medicine recommendations. She is currently part of the team at Delta S Performance, which has offices in Colorado, Massachusetts, and here locally in Riverside, Rhode Island. Welcome, Dr. Crifasi.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. We're glad to be a participant in this with you. And I hopefully will do an adequate job. My goal today, of course, is to share with everybody how the brain exacerbates pre-existing conditions. And it's not as simple as I was hoping it would be to express. So please, my goal is to help you understand all of this better. So by all means, put those answers and questions that you have in the chat. And if we don't have the opportunity to get to them all today, I certainly will reach out after. So that being said, what I'd like to do is to go ahead and just introduce myself. I am the Regional Clinical Director for the Northeast for Delta S Performance, and we're a functional neurology clinic. We do some functional medicine in the clinic, as well as Doreen had expressed in our training, because the gut and the brain are integrally related. In the holistic health world, we've known that for a long time, and science is proving that, and it's becoming more mainstream, which is really nice. It really helps when patients understand things to be more compliant. And, there's a whole lot that can be said when you are invested in something and you understand it, you appreciate it more. We were having a side conversation before the meeting started, is, we just don't go out and buy blue cars. We don't just go to the doctors. We have purposes for doing that. We go to a doctor because we have a symptom, because we have something that we want to not become a symptom, and we want to manage our health. When we buy a car, we buy the blue car because we like the way it looks in that style. And but we have to understand the workings. But I don't need to understand, like, from the engine key all the way to the exhaust. I just sort of assume that somebody does that. So that's sort of what I'm hoping to convey today. So without further ado, so some of the fundamental concepts that I wanted to go over is our brain's primary function is survival. Okay, our brain needs to survive. It is not this whole wiry network that a lot of people think it is. It's sort of this gelatinous goo that, in its ability to communicate, just sends these electrical connectivities everywhere. Within itself, within the brain, as I'll talk about a few times during this, is the lobes of the brain have to work independently, but they also have to work interdependently. Our brain is the first thing that is created, and the offshoot that is created from that is the spinal brainstem and the spinal cord. And the brainstem is sort of your major integrator. All of our cranial nerves come from that, and that's where a lot of our vital functions happen, which we'll get into in a few more minutes. So our brain survival is dependent on the availability of gravity. We have to be in gravity. Most of us on this call have lived through watching, the space age and understanding the importance. And there are implications to those that come back when they've been out of gravity for a period of time. Our brain is also dependent on oxygen, fuel, and activation. And that's where we come in, is making sure that we're firing the activation in the appropriate areas to make up for potential deficits that happen. The activity in the neuron has to do with gene expression, okay? We want that gene to express itself. We don't want something doing something else. One great example of that is endometriosis, which is a condition that women experience. When you have endometrial tissue in areas it doesn't belong, it is a very painful experience for somebody. Endometrial tissue is great when it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, but when it's someplace else, it can cause trouble. When something else happens in an area because the body or the brain or the connections tell it to do so, it may not be the ideal situation for that particular function. So all of this activation that we're talking about, this allows for neuronal growth, okay, or what we know as neuroplasticity or neuroplastic changes. That's what our goal is. We always want to be stretching and growing and going. Many years ago, they used to say if somebody had a stroke, well, if you don't get it in the next 3 months, you lost it. No, that's not true. We're showing that years after changes have occurred, we can go through and be able to do more to stimulate surrounding areas and make up for some potential deficits. So that is a long-term potentiation that we're looking for when we start working with patients. It's not just what happens in the office, it's creating changes that are going to last, and allow the brain to keep basically feeding upon itself and keep that activity firing. Now, if decreased, a cell becomes unstable. When that happens, it's going to deform itself to a level that is and demand that is placed upon it. So what does that mean? That means if you don't have enough cell integrity, it's only going to be able to give out what it can give out. When that happens, depending on whether the cell has just become weakened and sort of collapse on itself, like kind of a balloon that goes and deflates a little bit, but then you can add air to go back up. But if it sat in the sun or it got stuck to something, when you go to pull it apart, you've lost the cell, you've lost the balloon. That's what we're trying not to do. When that happens, that's what's known as, that's a typo, that's transneural degeneration, long-term depression, retrograde changes, or a spreading depression.
Excuse
and that
me,
is
Dr. Crifasi, are you
Yeah.
sharing the screen at the moment? Because I just see you.
I thought I was. Okay. Hang on.
Right.
Let's see here. Let me get back out. Technology. Hang on. Here. How about now? Can you see it now, Doreen?
I am not seeing it.
All right. Hang
Richard,
on.
have you allowed her to share screen?
Yes, I did.
All right, let me do it again.
Okay.
How about now?
There you go. Perfect.
All right.
Thank
So we'll
you.
get back to that original screen. So sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
I thought it was all
Sorry to
good.
interrupt you, but yep, thank you.
No, I'm glad that you did. So again, just leave this up for another moment or two. So again, we're looking for survival. That survival is going to be based upon gravity, oxygen, and creating an environment where the cells can sustain and create neuroplasticity, where we can stimulate other parts. When that doesn't happen, there's something that happens known as transneural degeneration. And then there's decreased fluid activation, which can cause the cell to go towards death. Our brain is the first thing that's created. Okay, so it's responsible for every action, every reaction, every function, perception, misperception that we have. So we need to be able to be in a constant environment in gravity so that our body can determine where we are in space and where space and our environment is around us. So we have to be able to integrate all of our senses to be able to appropriately call upon that and then guide ourselves, both consciously and subconsciously. If not, this may reflect in a type of sign or a type of symptom that the body may have. So that's what we're looking for. And that's where there's a link when people sometimes have certain types of symptoms from a trauma, it may trigger some other things. So we look for adjustments or changes in the nervous system. Okay. Stimulation time is brief. Okay. We don't need a whole lot. Pathways from the periphery to targets need to be intact in order for us to have a profound effect. A good example of that might be somebody who has Parkinson's or Parkinsonian syndrome, where their goal is to go out and reach, but their target may end up wandering over. So they may have the initial phases of what we need. It just may not be able to be sustaining and carry through. So, as I said, there's about 100 billion neurons in the human brain. Chimpanzees are the closest. They only have 8 million. So there's a lot of nerves that have a lot to do. And the neuron's job is to receive and transmit information in order to differentiate it and specialize it. So knowing you want to lift something up is great, but you have to also, for example, know, am I lifting up something heavy or am I lifting up something small? Am I perceiving what somebody is saying to me as a big deal? Or am I becoming inappropriately perceiving what their intention is because I may be in a limbic state? I may not have the wherewithal within my cells to transmit the information from my frontal lobe and my visual frontal eye fields, transmit the information to the back of my brain to my visual cortex. It may be going right into the amygdala, creating a lot of anxiety. So this is why it's important that our stimulation time be accurate and appropriate. Corrections have been found in literature to have some predictable effects on the brain. So what we're finding is we know that each lobe of the brain has general functions that we can expect for it to do. Well, we also find that there are things that can happen that can support parts of the brain that aren't functioning appropriately. So things that can affect this are trauma, which is emotional, physical, and physiological. This can change the frequency of firing in some area of some of these centralized neurons. Changes in the firing of these neurons can create a misfiring and or maintain the misfiring or create subluxations, which in the chiropractic realm, which is my initial form of professional degree, is a bone that is out of place structurally that has a physiological effect on the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system, and the integration of the processes of the nerves and vessels that surround it. So it's not bone stuck out of place, me push, it's what are the effects of that? Because that can be, which I'll get to in a little while, certain areas that can be very profound and have a huge impact on the body, which can then create, as many of you know, our body holds on to memories. We have muscle memory, we have mental memory, and these can be triggers for people. So maintaining this and making sure there's this innate ability for our body to maintain our own state of health, when we're under stress, external stressors. Now, we should all get startled if glass breaks, or like my case a few minutes ago, Verizon pulls up in front of my house. I'm like, oh, please don't cut off my internet. So I could have had a very inappropriate reaction to that, or I simply walked outside and said, please don't tell me you're turning off my power right now. And they said, well, did you pay your bill? I'm like, of course I did. We made a joke out of it. Or I could have gone out there going, don't you dare do anything. I have this important talk. It's about how we take that information in. So it's the phenotypic genetic expression. Okay, I have this potential crisis. I can go out. I'm from New York. I have that fight or flight is innate in who I am. Or I can go out and take a deep breath, do the different things I know, keep it in check, and then negotiate. That's, one example. There's multitudes of interactions with one's environment that dictates this innate expression in order for us to go into a state of health. The human nervous system is a common thread in this expression, all right? The ability to both change its function and direct the interaction with the environment is what allows our service to help both the sick and infirmed, as well as the profound and infinitely valuable people that are on a wellness path. Being counted, being embraced and understanding the neuronal system and applying our skills, all right? We need to determine the functioning state as much of the nervous system as possible in a reliable manner. The changes that we need to see, all of us that are in healthcare, need to be easily observed and a reliable indicator of health in a related part to the nervous system. So again, if somebody comes to me and they're saying they're feeling dizzy, well, guess what? Dizzy can create anxiety. Anxiety is going to change your physiology. It is going to change a state of all of your autonomic functions. When that happens, you've got to be able to get it back into check, or it could really go down a very negative trajectory that can lead to truly into a pathological situation or bring somebody back into a limbic response. When we have perceptions of things following a certain path, that can be from neurological conditioning. It can be from emotional patterning. It can become from your life experiences that, every time you have this experience, it creates that you're going to be in bed for a while. Or when you have this experience, it always ends up in an argument, that it creates people into triggering into migraines like we spoke of. You're going to change the vascularity. That could change the cardiovascular health. And if this is over long term, this can go on and have very, very extreme effects on patients' overall health. So basic anatomical and functional principles. Okay, activation in receptors from one side of the environment usually creates greater activity on the ipsilateral, same-sided cerebellum and the contralateral brain. The human cortex, the part of the brain that most people are used to seeing, has 6 layers, ranging from more primitive and simple to very highly developed and complex. 10% of our descending output of information from the brain in the older portion of the brain, predominantly corticospinal tract, is involving voluntary movement and the sympathetic nervous system. 90% of the descending output of the brain involves a fairly tonic, reflexive, and automatic/autonomic functioning. So the best place to quote unquote see the 90 to 10% segregation is in the descending fibers of the internal capsule. All right, so what's the internal capsule? It's the white matter. White matter in the brain is the fastest conducting matter that we have, and it's situated in the intermedial portion of the cerebral hemispheres of the brain. It carries information from a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, and it separates the caudate nucleus and the thalamus from the putamen and the globus pallidus. So I'm not sure the range of who's here, so I try to cover all bases for everybody. So what it's basically saying is that the neostriatum, where it takes the information and runs with it, needs to really be intact for us. Motor activity descending from the cerebral cortex is mostly ipsilateral to the brainstem and the spinal cord. So most of our environmental receptors are stimulated from the external environment. We get input. We can feel the wind from the fan or a breeze from outside. It's not from motor innervation. Okay, it can be, but again, the effects of what we work on is, yes, we look at the grand scheme of things where we work with the motor system, but we also want to make sure that the intrinsic functions are happening so that your brain can take data in, your eyes can take in data, and that you're able to see the world with the appropriate amount of dilation and constriction, and your eyes are moving in tandem. But each time a neuron causes another to change, membrane receptors may be impacted. It can be impacted, of course, if there's a blunt trauma to the eye, or to any other part of the body for that matter. It's how that brain takes the information in and goes, come on, boys, girls, we got to fix this. You know, family's in trouble. We got to bond together. That's what we're looking for, is that opportunity to be able to take all of this information in and look over it and then go, all right, we need to stimulate this. We need to integrate this differently and to get the appropriate response. So, and here we are. Okay, so the nature of the receptor determines the response of the neurotransmitter. So, you know, we all here know we don't have like a bunch of spaghetti running through our body. We have a lot of different size nerves, okay? And we talked about there's 1 billion nerves. For each one of those nerve contacts, you can have 15,000 different contacts thereafter from that one single nerve. And many nerves have the capacity to stimulate more than one. They have dendrites on them that allow them to affect more than one region and area at a time. So we have to make sure that the different receptors are responding differently to sometimes the same neurotransmitter. You have to have enough of the appropriate constituents in a cell to be able to have that chemical come across the nerve and then be picked up by, let's say, the arachidonic acid. So for example, you have to have the appropriate ratio of DHA and omega-3, omega-6 ratio. And then when you have that arachidonic acid can then appropriately bind and then send the signal further down into a nerve. So the frequency of the firing is determined by the frequency of the firing of the presynaptic neuron to itself. So the neurons are going to draw from a variety of areas to perpetuate its survival. Because remember, the function of the brain is to survive. And activity happens very quickly and frequently. Believe it or not, our brain is only able to manage one thing at a time. We just do it at warp speed. And so it's very important. So you want to receive in the connection, receive and transmit information. We want the conduction of about 50,000 messages per minute faster than 100 miles per hour, each and every one of them. Like I said, one neuron can directly communicate with up to 15,000 others. When one reaches its threshold, it's got a signal along the axon, and then vessels have to be able to open and chemicals need to be released in a space called a cleft. And this, based on the support of the cell there or the surrounding cells, it may or may not bring those into threshold. There's no single neuronal input that triggers an action potential because they are too weak individually. So what if there were a region that were too weak? That region is going to then, down the line, affect more and more things. So if you, for example, have a weak cerebellum on the right side, not only are you likely to have poor output on the right side, it's quite possible that that information getting sent up, knowing either consciously or subconsciously you've got a blind spot in your active field of life, could cause anxiety if you are, let's say, right hand dominant, or you need to use your left sided weak post-stroke, or whatever the case may be. There's so many different reasons that it can create anxiety. Well, when you live in a state of anxiety, again, your physiology is going to change, which it goes all the way down to the cellular level. Causes of subthreshold changes, if, going back to basic cellular anatomy, is we're supposed to have sodium on the outside, 35-to-1 ratio, potassium on the inside, 10-to-1. Proteins, healthy proteins are most responsible for keeping, the inside of a cell negatively charged. We live in America. Carbohydrates are what most people tend to favor. Okay, that's not protein. There's the whole discussion of, I don't want to get too much into this, but there are certain things that have molecular mimicry, and that would be gluten and dairy. Gluten and dairy have molecular mimicry, particularly to the cerebellar part of the brain, which can also cause people to be unstable. But if that autoimmune reaction that can happen isn't just, oh, I don't feel well, I can't eat gluten, I can't eat carbs. It can have an impact on how your body maintains your overall gut and brain health. So, excuse me, everybody, I've been sick for a little bit, so I'm sorry if I have to keep interrupting here. We need to make sure that these internal organelles are maintained as much as possible, so that the cell membrane and the neurotransmitters have the ability to create the depolarization and bringing those cells closer to threshold. And the depolarization of potassium rushes out, getting away from threshold, because we need these nerves. It's a checks and balances all the time, constantly in our brain to govern our body. So, how close is a neuron to threshold? About 70 millivolts, due to the sodium and potassium equilibrium. Now, there are thousands of dendrites connecting to thousands of other cells. So the appropriate integration of these positive and negative impulses determines whether the cells fire or not. When the sympathetic and parasympathetic, autonomic, and neuroimmunological systems are functioning in equilibrium, it's not a problem. When somebody knows, or we know that somebody has some sort of a consideration, perhaps they have ADHD, we know their brain's not firing. Perhaps they just have a generalized anxiety disorder or PTSD. We already know that there's already a significant compromise in the way their cells are able to take the information from the neurotransmitters. They may actually tend to deplete some of their neurotransmitters. Particularly, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So we need to make sure that we try to keep them a combination of well supplemented if needed, certainly medicated if that is appropriate, as well as activated in the functional world to make sure that their systems are building up and not going towards the key terms like transneural degeneration, which I spoke of earlier, which is neuronal death, which can lead to an increase or a decrease in a neuron central integrative state, which we'll speak of in a few more minutes. But when brain cells die, they die. But what we can do is create a supporting network around that. So when somebody has a stroke, no matter what I do, I can't get that particular lesioned area to ever work again. What we can do is to work those areas around that to help to support whatever's going on. So when somebody has transneural degeneration, it can manifest itself in many symptoms. Many patients that come in after a concussion will then say that they're having the same symptoms that they had post-COVID or when they were a kid and had ADHD, because it has the same impact physiologically. It's just manifesting itself in a different way. Same thing, patients that have COVID may find our anxiety goes up and may trigger, OCD type tendencies or, ADHD tendencies. It's not uncommon because our neurons don't turn on or off for that matter. They have to always be firing appropriately. So there's a tonic inhibition, which controls the different mechanisms. First to suffer from heavy metals, ischemia, which is lack of blood flow, inflammation, and neurotransmitter fluctuations. So we want to allow for uninhibited pathways. meaning we want the pathways to work as appropriately as they should be. They should be able to inhibit themselves when we're like, you're getting a little wound up there, kid. Chill out a little bit. Or like in my example before, I could have gone outside arms a blaring with these guys, getting ready to climb a tree and put in a new wire, or you just regulate and do certain things to allow the brain to fire more appropriately in everyday life and in particular situations where we know that people are at those threshold levels. So the activation process, receptor activation, it's intracellular messages go to the nucleus of the cell to create a genetic expression where we have appropriate proteins that are released for, or utilized, I should say, for organelle health and overall cellular health. Overall cellular health gets you overall generalized health. There's something called an MDA receptor, which are critical for allowing calcium into the cell. This can be good or bad depending on the receptor's activation. It can literally be a life versus death response. So on the cell membrane allowing calcium in, we want it to go in appropriately. Sometimes when we have trauma to cells, or if we have something called apoptosis, we're going to pop out some magnesium plugs. And then when we don't have enough magnesium in the cell, it's going to affect the integrity of the lining of the cell. And then that, again, can inhibit the functioning within the cell and therefore to its, further constituents down the line. So we want to shift it toward more pro-life activities rather than transneural degeneration. Our society is heading towards that in many ways. There's, lots of discussion about 5G. There's lots of discussion. We know the nutrients in our soil and in our air are strongly depleted. So we've got to monitor the metabolic capacity of our cells and be mindful of, what we're taking in, what we're surrounding ourselves with. One of the things that we talk about with our patients is all of our devices, no matter having dark screens and things like that, we're still getting, you put that item up to a wall, you're going to see a blue light, and blue light will penetrate a closed lid. It will go, through your retina, up your optic nerve, into your brain, keep your hypothalamus on. Your hypothalamus is part of your limbic system, in your amygdala, in your primitive brain, and can keep people in a high state of anxiety for no other reason but that. If you're always in a high state of anxiety, you're going to be depleting some of your dopamine stores. You start messing up your sleep and your wake cycles, your eating cycles. So it can really get complicated. So the amount of stimulation a neuron or pathway or system can withstand before failing is what we're trying to figure out. So it's strongly associated with mitochondrial health. We know in the more significant health concerns that most of our population has unfortunately directly or indirectly been impacted by, like cancers and more significant pathologies like that, as mitochondrial health has been significantly compromised. That's our powerhouse in the cell. We need to make sure that stays strong. Now, how do we measure metabolic capacity? We use it through our autonomics. Again, those autonomically functioning systems, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, pupillary changes, vasomotor changes. So neuronal activity gives the neuron energy to properly make and partition its proteins to allow the neuron to work optimally. Normal protein production keeps the inside of the cell relatively negative compared to the outside with regard to our resting healthy health potentials. So the three keys to neuronal survival, again, oxygen, fuel delivery, and activation. All right, we've got to keep it stimulated. Kind of that snooze it or lose it, but with a far more greater impact than many of us ever thought before. When you breathe faster, you're actually taking in less oxygen. And, if you want to test that, go breathe. You're going to pass out faster than if you took long, slow, deep breaths. All right. When you breathe faster, your pH increases. Then the calcium's ability to dissolve in the blood goes down, which we already talked about that relative to whether it's going in and off of a cell, leading to physiological hypocalcemia. Well, guess what? That hypocalcemia can cause your body to steal calcium from your bones and in your teeth to supplement the loss, because our body is infinitely amazing. So 85% of the general public is vitamin D and calcium deficient. Some of the things that we look for is we look for blepharospasms. Are their eyelids spasming like this? Is there a percussion myotonia? Is the rib excursion off? Is pulse ox diminished? Having recently been experiencing COVID, that's huge. And yeah, my normal thing when you compromise is you can't breathe as deeply, and then you start to get a little bit lightheaded, and one thing leads into the other. There's a quick trick that you can do where you take a small breath and then follow it up with a deeper breath. And they think that's actually an innate system that was designed, and that's what little kids do, that, or adults too, the heavy sobbing. Okay, that's a better way. You do this short, quick breath and then a long inhalation, and then hold it and then blow it out for the equivalent length that you've inhaled. I mean, there's a ton of different breathing techniques, but that's a really, really simple and effective way to be able to do that. Fuel delivery. How does the fuel delivery work? So our intrinsic spinal muscles, okay, the really deep, teeny tiny ones, some of which are as small as the nail on my finger, those fire into the midline nucleus of our cerebellum and the fastigial nucleus, for those of you that are neuro nerds. And this goes into the part of the midbrain. Then it contacts the neostriatum, which I spoke of earlier. Then it goes into the frontal lobe, where it's going to discern. Your frontal lobe is your executive functioning. It decides what's happening and when, and that's where our visual cortex is. And it goes back to the neostriatum, where it integrates and gives us motor consequences as to controlling rate of breathing, heart contractility, and the ability to shunt blood or not. I'm sure many of you have experienced somebody who's gone to sit up and oh no, that's not happening. So we need to make sure that their blood pressure is properly managed. Ever heard of a stroke? According to Blumenfeld, 50% of all neurological disease is due to a lack of blood flow. The most common spinal cord segments to suffer ischemia are T4, which is behind your heart, and L1, which is your last under your rib cage, which is where your kidneys and adrenals more or less lie. Your dynamic blood pressure reading must be assessed, especially for people with digestive issues, because obviously if you're not shunting blood, if you're shunting blood because you're not digesting things, and again, I'm going to go back to gluten, for example, or somebody who has a food sensitivity or a food allergy, if you're, sorry about that. I don't know how to turn that up. Then, excuse me, then the blood is shunting there to deal with the inflammation that you have going on. We know in a trauma, within 30 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, there's a breakdown of the zonulin bridges between the gut and the brain. There's automatically brain-gut inflammation going on, and that's a minor concussion. So they do have the same diameter blood vessels, which again contribute to ischemia. Activation and stimulation. The brain gets activated not only from planning and execution of movements, but from proprioceptive feedback. Proprioception, where are you in space? Am I getting this information? Or am I banging into the wall all the time on the left side? This helps the brain to know where the body is in space, like we spoke of earlier. This information travels through the biggest, most myelinated nerves for the highest speed of transmission. And the highest density of these mechanoreceptors are in the cervical spine. One of the reasons it's so important that when there's a trauma that people brace the cervical spine. Dr. Robert Sperry, who's a Nobel laureate, demonstrated that 90% of the energy entering the brain is from the spine. So the more mechanically distorted a person is, the less energy is going to be available for thinking clearly and metabolism for healing. So your sympathetic nervous system, which I've abbreviated SMS, that's our fight or flight. It originates in the IML of the spinal cord, and it requires oxygen and nutrients to conduct messages from the brain to the end organ via blood transmission. This is important because when we've overstimulated or unregulated the SNS, it can cause a problem in almost any organ system. So why does every stimulus activate the IML? It's sympathetic embryology. It's the way we were developed. Okay, medial versus dorsal spinal cord becomes myotomes. The lateral crest via the ventral or front of the spinal cord becomes your sensory ganglia, your dorsal nerve root ganglia, your sympathetic ganglia. The dorsal nerve root ganglia is where many conditions reside. That's one of the concerns they're having about COVID. COVID is manifesting itself as a central nervous system and respiratory vascular condition. We know that herpes zoster will hold itself in the dorsal nerve root ganglia. A lot of tick-borne illnesses, sexually transmitted diseases and such. So it's very important that we keep our central nervous system functioning, moving, and firing appropriately. So the developmental relationship, we've already touched on that. During development, if the mother is stressed, her sympathetic nervous system is going to release stress hormone transmitters. The level of the sympathetics is based upon the ability of the brain to attenuate it appropriately or not. This stimulates the developing embryo's lateral crest, which causes babies to develop at a very low threshold of pain. And then they have a very plastic sympathetic nervous system. We want it to be neuroplastic. We want it to be ever developing. We don't want it to be stuck, because you can do negative stuff. Like people that just sit around, that's negative neuroplasticity. That's not what we want. We need people moving, integrating, and doing all the different things that they know that they can be doing to keep their bodies functioning. And even if people are limited in their abilities, there's things that can be done to their capacity. And that's stuff that we have to work with every day. A decrease in brain function is going to have a decrease in your ability to regulate the IML. No way around it. When the central sympathetic nervous system is appropriately inhibited, the peripheral nervous system is inversely responsive. So high sympathetics, low peripheral nervous system, and vice versa, and parasympathetic nervous system. So we want that fight or flight and wine and dine. So the parasympathetic nervous system should, kind of keep you in check, and it should be in equal weights and measures. The windup that happens in the mesencephalon or in the midbrain or the IML, your job gets harder. Okay, windup is a result of negative neuroplasticity, and this can create premature transneural degeneration. So when people are constantly wound up, it's just, you're not going to be able to turn it down, and then the brain is not going to work as well for a while. And then you can then have long-term physiological effects. So I see some people have some things in the chat. I'm going to go through until the end and then address all those. So reconditioning, less movement, less mechanoreceptors, less cortex stimulation. So you're just going to be a lump. Nothing's going to move. Your brain's going to decompensate. Less pontomedullary reticular formation. That's the brainstem. If you ever saw the brainstem, when you draw it, just comes down, you got the bump, and then you've got the medulla oblongata. Everybody knows that from Adam Sandler. That's where your cranial nerves are. Then there's going to be an inhibition of, less inhibition of the IML, and it's going to create increase in cortisol and catecholamines. That's going to lead to plasticity in the nervous system, shortness of breath. We all know those high anxiety people, which probably like I sound like right now trying to get through this. High blood pressure, people with constant sweating, and tired just when standing still. The other interesting thing is sometimes people sweat more on one side than another. That's also another sign of dysfunction. Things, at least if they're happening, even if they're not happening in a good way, we like them to be happening symmetrically. So autonomic neurotransmitters, sympathetic neurotransmitters is norepinephrine, which is, speaking of sweat, except for sweat glands, that would be the acetylcholine neurotransmitter. Your parasympathetic neurotransmitter that's predominant is acetylcholine. There are others, but again, just for the simplicity of this talk, I wanted to just get as much of an overview in here and try and tie it all together for everybody. So your PMRF, pyramidal paresis, and soft paresis, when there is a change in this, it's a soft paralysis. And so what happens is people will hunch over around their bra line, just to kind of give you a landmark. And then their hips flex forward and then their knees bend. It's basically what it looks like is a Parkinsonian posture, or kids texting with a backpack. That's what it looks like. Those can have long-term consequences. All right. Sometimes people just literally cannot stand up straight because the way that the nervous system is firing. We don't want that, because long-term that just this posture here can constrict the functioning of the lungs 30%. So we want blood pressure controlled, the IML to be higher on the PMRF side. The heart rate decreases on the right PMRF. That can lead to arrhythmias. On the left side, perfusion can be decreased. You can get hypotonia globally. People can get a ptosis in one eye, which I'll exaggerate it here, where you get a lid lag, or the eye can droop a little bit. People will tend to have chronic sprains and strains when there's perpetual dysfunction. We've already talked about asymmetrical sweating. Direct light reflex test in the central integrated state. Your central integrated state is when everything in the body is firing the way that it should be and maintaining itself the way that it should be. It's based on the integrity of the cells and the ability of those cells to transmit the information vis-a-vis blood, neurotransmitters, electrical conductivity to the next nerve, to get you the activity that you're trying to get, whether it's a survival, whether it's emotional, whether it's trying to manage a symptom like a headache, if it's trying to manage an injury. We've got to get the balance and coordination of the occipital lobes and the cerebellum. I just got this study yesterday. In the United States, the national rate of anxiety in 2019, now 2019, that's pre-pandemic, tripled from 8.1% to 25.5%, and depression almost quadrupled from 6.5% to 24.3%. In the brain of people suffering with depression, anxiety, and many other mental health challenges, the immune system is activated with evidence for elevated levels of inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. Just like rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease represent inflammation in the joints and gut, respectively, psychiatric disorders are linked to inflammation in the brain. If we hope to gain control over these mental issues, we must address quenching the brain's inflammation. So when patients come into our office, they're sent paperwork a couple of days ahead of time. It has to be, well, sent to them, and we have to get it a couple of days ahead of time. Our exam is about an hour and a half to 2 hours. We're testing all of the lobes of the brain. We're testing all the cranial nerves. We're testing the sensory and motor function in more than one way. We're testing blood pressure, the autonomic nervous system. We're doing it bilaterally in a variety of positions. We are testing pulse ox, all the things I've told you about. We're testing the vestibular system. We're making sure that the lobes of the brain are functioning independently and interdependently, and how they're working within themselves and then within the rest of the body. I do my walk talk for those of you that had come to the office. We do the walk talk chew gum test. We have to see how all this integrates. We're going to do this as a bedside exam. We do have technology that checks pupillometry. So I'm going to take a basically 5 to 7 second picture of each eye, which gives me an enormous amount of data that is quantifiable, it's measurable, and it lets us know the integrity of how your eye is responding. Is there a link to that, to the potential risk of having had a trauma, a concussion, or a neurodegenerative condition? How quickly is the pupil accommodating? It's another indication of your autonomic nervous system. We don't think, oh, gee, it's bright outside. Let my eye dilate. Let me constrict. If I look to the left and it's bright, we don't do that. That stuff should be happening right away. It also gives us measurements of the changes, which is wonderful. I have a balanced tracking system because, anxiety is going to go up, which is going to affect your heart rate when patients are unaware of where they are in space, as well as if there is a vestibular component, that makes you always feel like you're nauseous, creating an interaction in your body that's not ideal. We also have vestibular oculography goggles that when patients come in, we're putting those in to make sure their eyes have a conjugate movement. If you have one eye that's moving one way and one eye that's catching up, and it happens more than you'd realize, then that's going to have inappropriate perception of where you are in space. So when appropriate, we use these pieces of equipment. We're entering a new office shortly. We'll be moving our Boston office to a more central location. It's going to have a lot more technology and help us to be part of some board review type research studies. We also do run blood labs on patients. We are scientifically based. We don't do energy fields and things like that. We're truly doing what's scientifically appropriate to get the appropriate measurements that are needed. We have labs available to us to see if there's been a breach of the blood-brain barrier and things of that nature. So I know I need to wind this down here. So I sort of talked about this. I do have one video I want to show. I just want to thank you. This is like just a simplistic overview. Our company is Delta S Performance. I'm available for more questions. I love talking about what I do. There's only about 350 of us in the country that do this. So this is a new field. So a lot of people don't understand what we're doing, but basically you see from the top of this picture, sensory systems create input. That input goes into the brain and the brainstem. It should have a quantified output, and that motor output also has a role on our psychology.